The Cain and Abel story, found in Genesis 4, is a foundational narrative in Judeo-Christian tradition. It introduces themes of sibling rivalry, divine favor, jealousy, and the origins of violence. Cain, a farmer, and Abel, a shepherd, are the sons of Adam and Eve. Both offer sacrifices to God, but God favors Abel's offering, sparking Cain's anger and leading to Abel's murder. This part sets the stage by summarizing the narrative and its significance as the first recorded act of human violence post-Eden. Cain and Abel are born after Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden, living in a world marked by labor and separation from God's direct presence. Their story reflects the consequences of the fall, humanity's propensity for sin. This part explores how the parents' disobedience sets a backdrop for the brothers' conflict, emphasizing the generational transmission of moral struggle. Cain, the firstborn, is a tiller of the ground. His role reflects humanity's toil to cultivate the earth, a task cursed after the fall. This part examines Cain's identity, his pride in his labor, and how his offering of crops might symbolize his desire for self-sufficiency. It contrasts Cain's grounded, sedentary life with Abel's nomadic shepherding. Abel, the younger brother, is a keeper of sheep. Shepherding often symbolizes care and guidance in biblical texts, later exemplified by figures like Moses and David. This part explores Abel's role, his offering of the firstlings of his flock, and why it might have pleased God. It considers whether Abel's humility or the nature of his sacrifice played a role. Cain offers the fruit of the ground, while Abel offers the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. The text doesn't explicitly state why God prefers Abel's offering, sparking centuries of debate. This part explores possible reasons. Was it the quality of the sacrifice, the heart behind it, or a divine preference for blood offerings? God's acceptance of Abel's offering and rejection of Cain's triggers Cain's anger. His countenance fell, signaling deep emotional turmoil. This part analyzes Cain's response, jealousy, shame, or wounded pride, and how divine favor, or its absence, shapes human behavior. It also considers God's role in allowing this disparity. Before the murder, God speaks to Cain, "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door." This part explores God's intervention as both a warning and an opportunity for repentance. It highlights the concept of free will and the ever-present temptation to sin. The metaphor of sin, crouching at the door, is vivid and haunting. This part delves into the imagery, portraying sin as a predatory force waiting to pounce. It examines how this personification reflects the insidious nature of jealousy and anger, which can overtake us if unchecked. Despite God's warning, Cain chooses to act on his anger, luring Abel to the field and killing him. This part explores the role of free will in Cain's decision, questioning whether his actions were inevitable or a deliberate rejection of God's counsel. It considers the moment of choice as a universal human experience. The murder itself is described briefly. Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. This part reflects on the starkness of the act, the first bloodshed in human history, and its irreversibility. It explores the psychological and spiritual weight of taking a life, especially as siblings. After the murder, God asks Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" Echoing God's question to Adam in Eden, this inquiry invites accountability. This part examines God's approach, knowing yet questioning, and Cain's evasive response, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Cain's retort, "Am I my brother's keeper?" is both a denial of guilt and a rejection of responsibility. This part analyzes his defiance, comparing it to modern tendencies to deflect blame. It explores how denial can deepen one's isolation from God and community. God declares, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." This powerful imagery suggests that Abel's blood demands justice. This part explores the idea of creation bearing witness to human sin and the enduring consequences of violence. God curses Cain, declaring that the ground will no longer yield to him and that he will be a fugitive and a wanderer. This part examines the curse's severity, linking it to Cain's identity as a farmer and the loss of his livelihood. It contrasts this with the mark of protection God later provides. God places a mark on Cain to protect him from vengeance, despite his crime. This part explores the mark's ambiguity. Is it a sign of mercy, shame, or both? It considers interpretations across traditions, from a physical mark to a symbol of divine grace. Cain is banished to the land of Nod, east of Eden. This part reflects on his exile as both a punishment and a new beginning. It explores the emotional and spiritual isolation of living as a fugitive, cut off from family and God's presence. Despite his curse, Cain builds a city and has descendants, including Lamech, who boasts of even greater violence. This part examines how Cain's sin reverberates through generations, introducing the spread of corruption in early humanity. Theologians have long debated Cain and Abel's story. This part explores key interpretations: Augustine's view of Cain as representing earthly desires versus Abel's spiritual devotion, and Jewish midrashim that emphasize Cain's potential for repentance. It considers how the story informs doctrines of sin and redemption. From a psychological lens, Cain's story reflects sibling rivalry, projection of anger, and the struggle for parental, or divine, approval. This part explores how jealousy and insecurity drive destructive behavior, drawing parallels to modern psychological theories like Freud's Oedipal conflict or Adler's inferiority complex. Philosophically, Cain and Abel raise questions about justice, free will, and the nature of evil. This part examines how thinkers like Hobbes or Rousseau might interpret the story, questioning whether humans are inherently prone to conflict. The Cain and Abel story has inspired art, literature, and film, from Byron's Cain to Steinbeck's East of Eden. This part explores its cultural legacy, highlighting how it serves as a metaphor for betrayal, rivalry, and the human condition across diverse contexts. Sacrifice is central to the story, reflecting ancient practices of offering to God. This part explores the broader biblical context of sacrifice, from Abel's offering to the later Levitical system, and how it symbolizes devotion, atonement, or surrender. Cain's envy and anger are the catalysts for his crime. This part offers practical lessons on managing these emotions, drawing from both biblical wisdom and modern strategies like mindfulness or cognitive reframing. Despite its darkness, the story hints at redemption. God's mercy in protecting Cain suggests hope for sinners. This part explores how the narrative foreshadows later biblical themes of forgiveness and restoration, such as the prodigal son or Christ's atonement. The Cain and Abel story remains relevant in addressing modern issues like family conflict, workplace rivalry, and societal violence. This part applies its lessons to today's world, encouraging readers to foster empathy, accountability, and reconciliation in their communities. God's selective response, favoring Abel's offering without explaining why, creates tension in the story. This part examines the theme of divine silence, exploring why God withholds clarification from Cain. It considers whether this silence tests Cain's faith or highlights the mystery of divine will, a recurring theme in biblical narratives. Cain's journey, from favored firstborn to cursed wanderer, casts him as a tragic figure. This part analyzes his story through the lens of classical tragedy, where pride, flawed choices, and inevitable consequences converge. It compares Cain to figures like Oedipus, whose downfall stems from internal and external forces. Abel speaks no words in the narrative, yet his presence is profound. This part explores Abel's silence as a narrative device, emphasizing his role as a victim whose blood cries out. It considers how his passivity contrasts with Cain's agency, highlighting the power of the voiceless in moral stories. The earth, cursed after Adam's sin and now stained by Abel's blood, plays a central role. This part examines the ground as a witness to human actions, absorbing both labor and violence. It explores ecological readings of the text, where the land reflects humanity's moral state. Cain and Abel's conflict introduces sibling rivalry as a biblical motif, seen later in stories like Jacob and Esau or Joseph and his brothers. This part compares these narratives, noting how rivalry often leads to division but also redemption. It highlights God's role in navigating these tensions. The differing outcomes of Cain and Abel's sacrifices raise ethical questions about intention versus outcome. This part explores whether Cain's offering was inherently flawed or if his heart lacked sincerity. It draws on ethical theories, like Kant's focus on motive, to assess the morality of their actions. Cain's anger escalates from rejection to murder. This part examines the psychology of anger, drawing on modern research about emotional regulation. It considers how Cain might have mastered sin through strategies like self-awareness or seeking dialogue with God or Abel. God's response to Cain, cursing yet protecting him, raises questions about divine justice. This part explores whether Cain's punishment fits his crime, comparing biblical justice to human systems. It considers restorative versus retributive justice in the context of Cain's exile. The Mark of Cain has inspired works like Herman Melville's Billy Budd and Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. This part examines how literature reinterprets the mark as a symbol of guilt, protection, or outsider status, reflecting society's fascination with moral ambiguity. From medieval frescoes to modern paintings, artists have depicted Cain and Abel's story vividly. This part explores visual interpretations, such as William Blake's dramatic renderings or Marc Chagall's emotive scenes, analyzing how art captures the story's emotional and spiritual depth. God's preference for Abel's offering mirrors human tendencies toward favoritism. This part examines how favoritism in families, workplaces, or societies breeds resentment, drawing parallels to Cain's reaction. It explores strategies for fostering equity to prevent conflict. Cain, despite his curse, builds a city named after his son Enoch. This part explores the paradox of a murderer founding civilization, questioning whether cities symbolize human progress or the spread of sin. It compares Cain's city to later biblical cities like Babel. Abel's blood cries out, ensuring his memory endures, while Cain's mark makes him unforgettable. This part examines memory as a theme, exploring how the story preserves the consequences of sin and the call for justice across generations. In Islamic tradition, the story of Qabil and Habil appears in the Quran, with unique details, like a raven teaching Cain to bury Abel. This part compares the Islamic and biblical accounts, highlighting shared themes of morality and divine guidance. Feminist readings note the absence of Eve or other women in the narrative, focusing instead on male conflict. This part explores how the story reflects patriarchal structures and considers Eve's potential role as a grieving mother, drawing on feminist theology to reimagine her perspective. Cain's crops and Abel's flocks represent different economic systems, agriculture versus pastoralism. This part examines how their offerings reflect labor's value and how God's preference might critique over-reliance on self-sufficiency versus interdependence. Political theorists like Locke and Rousseau have used Cain and Abel to explore the origins of conflict and governance. This part examines how the story informs ideas about the social contract, property rights, and the state's role in curbing violence. Cain's jealousy drives his actions, a response rooted in the brain's limbic system. This part explores neuroscience research on envy and aggression, explaining how these emotions activate the amygdala and how mindfulness can mitigate destructive impulses. Cain and Abel embody archetypes, the rejected outcast and the favored innocent. This part explores their story through Jungian psychology, where Cain represents the shadow self and Abel the ideal. It considers how these archetypes resonate in modern storytelling. The brothers' offerings are early forms of ritual sacrifice. This part examines the role of rituals in creating meaning and connection with the divine, exploring how Cain's failure to engage authentically undermines his spiritual life. Films like East of Eden and Amores Perros draw on Cain and Abel's themes of rivalry and betrayal. This part explores how cinema reinterprets the story, using it to comment on family, morality, and societal divides. The curse on Cain, that the ground will no longer yield, ties human sin to environmental consequences. This part explores the story's relevance to modern environmental ethics, questioning how humanity's actions harm the earth and how we might steward it better. Cain's lineage, ending with Lamech's boastful violence, suggests a downward spiral. This part examines how the story portrays cultural decline, contrasting it with the hope offered by Seth's line, which leads to Noah. Cain and Abel's story transcends its biblical context, appearing in myths worldwide, like Romulus and Remus in Roman lore. This part explores its universal themes, rivalry, sacrifice, and redemption, showing how they speak to shared human experiences. While the text doesn't explicitly show Cain seeking forgiveness, God's protection suggests mercy. This part explores forgiveness as a potential path for Cain, drawing parallels to later biblical calls for reconciliation, like Joseph forgiving his brothers. Songs like Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited and Iron Maiden's Murder in the Rue Morgue reference Cain and Abel. This part explores how music interprets the story, using its themes to comment on betrayal, guilt, or societal violence. Modern restorative justice focuses on healing rather than punishment. This part imagines how Cain's story might unfold with restorative practices, like dialogue with Abel's memory or community reconciliation, contrasting this with his punitive exile. Game theory analyzes competition and cooperation. This part frames Cain and Abel's conflict as a zero-sum game, where Cain perceives Abel's gain as his loss. It explores how cooperative strategies could have altered their story's outcome. The narrative leaves much unexplained: why God favored Abel, what the mark of Cain means, creating moral ambiguity. This part explores how this ambiguity invites readers to wrestle with questions of fairness, intent, and divine will. Cain and Abel's story challenges us to confront jealousy, seek accountability, and pursue peace. This part offers practical applications, like practicing gratitude to curb envy or engaging in community service to foster connection, encouraging readers to live out the story's lessons. Cain's fallen countenance suggests shame after God rejects his offering. This part explores shame as a driver of his anger and violence, drawing on psychological studies that link shame to aggression. It considers how Cain's inability to process shame leads to his destructive choice. Abel's role as the innocent victim resonates across religious traditions. This part examines Abel as a symbol of purity and sacrifice, comparing him to later biblical figures like Isaac or Jesus. It explores how his death underscores the cost of human sin. The text offers no insight into Abel's thoughts or personality, focusing solely on his actions. This part analyzes this silence, questioning whether Abel's lack of characterization makes him a blank slate for projection or emphasizes his role as a victim. After his curse, Cain fears others will kill him. This part explores his paranoia and the emergence of vengeance in human society. It considers who these others might be in a sparsely populated world, perhaps hinting at unmentioned communities. The mark of Cain can be seen as a social stigma, branding him as an outcast. This part examines how societies use visible or invisible marks to exclude, drawing parallels to modern practices like criminal records or public shaming. Jewish midrashim expand the Cain and Abel story, suggesting Cain's repentance or Abel's complicity in the conflict. This part explores these interpretive traditions, which humanize Cain and add complexity to the narrative, emphasizing moral growth over punishment. Anthropologically, Cain and Abel reflect the tension between agricultural and pastoral societies. This part examines how their conflict mirrors historical clashes between settled farmers and nomadic herders, exploring the cultural roots of such rivalries. Cain's banishment to Nod can be read as a spiritual journey, forcing him to confront his sin. This part explores exile as a transformative process in biblical narratives, comparing Cain's wanderings to later figures like Moses or the Israelites. The narrative implies a broader community, as Cain fears retribution and builds a city. This part examines the absent community's role, questioning how their presence might have mediated or escalated the brothers' conflict. In Christian theology, Abel is often seen as a type of Christ, offering a righteous sacrifice, while Cain represents sinful humanity. This part explores these typological readings, drawing on New Testament references like Hebrews 11 verse 4 and 1 John 3 verse 12. The narrative's portrayal of jealousy, anger, and guilt feels strikingly human. This part examines its psychological realism, comparing Cain's emotional arc to modern case studies of family conflict or workplace rivalry. Ethicists like Aristotle or Mill might analyze Cain's actions through virtue or consequentialist lenses. This part explores how Cain's failure to cultivate virtues like temperance or consider the consequences of murder leads to his downfall. Cain's punishment introduces themes of justice and mercy that influence later legal codes, like the Mosaic Law. This part examines how the story shapes ideas about crime, punishment, and protection in ancient and modern legal traditions. Beyond the Bible, Folklore versions of Cain and Abel appear in various cultures, often emphasizing moral lessons. This part explores examples like Ethiopian or Native American tales of sibling rivalry, highlighting shared human concerns. Cain's envy sets a precedent for conflicts throughout history, from wars to revolutions. This part examines envy as a historical force, drawing on examples like class struggles or colonial rivalries, and how it drives division. Cain's founding of a city juxtaposes his curse with creativity. This part explores this paradox, questioning whether civilization can arise from sin or if Cain's city represents a flawed attempt at redemption. Cain's emotional turmoil highlights mental health struggles like anger management or depression. This part explores how the story can inform modern mental health practices, encouraging empathy and intervention for those like Cain. Reflection: how do you support mental health? Think about a time you helped someone in distress. Part 73, Cain and Abel in Existential Philosophy, 8 minutes. Existentialists like Sartre or Camus might see Cain's story as a struggle for meaning in a seemingly arbitrary world. This part examines how Cain's rejection and exile reflect existential themes of freedom, responsibility, and despair. Reflection: how do you find meaning in chaos? Reflect on a moment when you faced life's absurdity. Part 74, The story's role in interfaith dialogue, 8 minutes. Cain and Abel appear in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic texts, making their story a bridge for interfaith dialogue. This part explores how shared narratives can foster understanding across religions, despite interpretive differences. Reflection: how do shared stories unite people? Consider a belief or tale you share with others. Part 75, The narrative's poetic structure, 8 minutes. Genesis 4 uses concise, poetic language to convey profound themes. This part analyzes the story's literary structure, noting its rhythm, repetition, and imagery, like sin crouching at the door, which enhance its emotional impact. Reflection: how does language shape a story's power? Think about a phrase that resonates with you. Part 76, Cain and Abel in Social Psychology, 8 minutes. Social psychology examines group dynamics like conformity or scapegoating. This part explores how Cain's isolation and Abel's favor reflect these dynamics, drawing on studies of in-group/out-group behavior. Reflection: how do group dynamics affect you? Consider a time when you felt included or excluded. Part 77, The story's connection to sacrifice rituals, 8 minutes. Cain and Abel's offerings prefigure later sacrificial systems in the Bible. This part examines how their story informs the theology of sacrifice, from Levitical offerings to Christ's atonement, emphasizing surrender to God. Reflection: what do you sacrifice for your beliefs? Think about a value you've prioritized. Part 78, Cain and Abel in Modern Literature, 8 minutes. Contemporary authors like Toni Morrison or Cormac McCarthy echo Cain and Abel's themes of violence and guilt. This part explores how modern novels use the story to probe human nature, morality, and redemption. Reflection: how does literature reflect your struggles? Consider a book that mirrored your life. Part 79, The story's lessons on conflict resolution, 8 minutes. Cain's failure to resolve his conflict with Abel offers lessons for today. This part explores conflict resolution strategies, like mediation or active listening, that could have altered the story's outcome. Reflection: how do you resolve conflicts? Reflect on a dispute you handled well or poorly. Part 80, Cain and Abel in Economic Inequality, 8 minutes. The brothers' differing outcomes mirror economic disparities. This part examines how the story reflects issues of unequal reward for labor, drawing parallels to modern debates about wealth distribution and fairness. Reflection: how do you view economic inequality? Think about a time you noticed unfair rewards. Part 81, The story's role in moral education, 8 minutes. Cain and Abel's story is often used to teach children about jealousy and consequences. This part explores its role in moral education, analyzing how its simplicity and drama make it a powerful tool for ethical lessons. Reflection: what stories shaped your morals? Consider a tale that taught you right from wrong. Part 82, Cain and Abel in post-colonial readings, 8 minutes. Post-colonial scholars might see Cain's dominance over Abel as a metaphor for oppression. This part explores how the story reflects power dynamics, comparing Cain's actions to colonial or imperial conquests. Reflection: how do power imbalances affect you? Think about a situation where power shaped outcomes. Part 83, the story's connection to forgiveness narratives, 8 minutes. While Cain's story lacks explicit forgiveness, it sets the stage for later biblical forgiveness narratives, like Esau and Jacob. This part explores how the story primes readers for themes of reconciliation and grace. Reflection: how does forgiveness heal? Reflect on a time when forgiveness restored a relationship. Part 84, Cain and Abel in popular culture, 8 minutes. From TV shows like Supernatural to video games like The Binding of Isaac, Cain and Abel inspire pop culture. This part examines how these adaptations reinterpret the story for entertainment and moral commentary. Reflection: how does pop culture shape your views? Consider a show or game that made you think. Part 85, Living the Story's Lessons, 8 minutes. The Cain and Abel narrative urges us to confront envy, seek accountability, and embrace mercy. This part offers practical steps, like journaling to process emotions or volunteering to build community, to live out the story's wisdom. Reflection: how will you apply this story? Commit to one action to foster peace or understanding. Subscribe to Divine Drive for more holy reflections and inspiration.